Hi, my name's Rafe, and I wanted to tell a bit of a story about how I got to be me. In 2002, my second wife, Maya, was dying of cancer. Well, she was diagnosed with cancer and she died in 2004. I'd been brought up in a what you might call traditional middle-class family in London, and they always wanted me to do better. Whatever I did, I could have done better. So I was always, in a lot of families that happens, and in a lot of families it debilitates the individual. It debilitated me to a certain extent, but it also liberated me from certain things. But it meant that I was quite often in trouble, and trouble seemed to, apparently to follow me around. So if my brother did something bad, it was probably my fault, and I got blamed. In the early parts, I suppose I tried to deny that I was involved even, and then I got accused of being a liar as well. So I got used to just taking the blame. It was so much easier. So I became a responsible person and did things responsibly in my life and took responsibility for things that were nothing to do with me. If the sun was out, it must be because I'm in a good mood. But I wasn't prepared to take Maya's death into my responsibility. So I sought help, and I found a psychotherapist in. I didn't know at the time why it appealed to me, but he was a Jewish psychotherapist, Isaac Pizer, and he fairly rapidly noticed that the stuff that I was carrying didn't really have anything to do with me. It was stuff that had been passed down to me through history. Coincidentally, there were a couple of things that happened at similar time. Was or actually some years before, I had been approached by what turned out to be a distant cousin, Vada Nowen, and she had an email address, vnowen@aol.com, and I used my what is now my second name but was my first name, Lawrence Nowen, as my email address, lnowen@aol.com, and she emailed off to her supposed sister, Lindsay, and said, "Hi, Linz, how are you doing? It's good to see that you're on email," and so on. And this was back in the early days of AOL delivering emails. So I responded and said, "Bada, it's not Linz, it's Lawrence, and I live in England," and so on. She invited me over. I went over and met the family and so on. And then in 1999, we all went over. The whole family went over for a Nowen family reunion, and there were 35 of us. Nowen is a very unusual name. There's only 200 or 300 in the world, so it's a rare name. At the same time or similar time, I got a phone call from a lady, Anne Massman, who sadly died last year. But she was researching her uncle, Walter Nowen, and she was in London. She'd come over from America, from New Mexico, where she lived, and she was researching in Somerset House to find records of Walter. And I went down to London to meet her. And what we found was that her great-grandfather, Carl Nowen, was my great-grandfather, Edward Nowen's brother, and therefore we were completely related. She'd been adopted at birth, so she and I, it was the first time she'd ever hugged a living relative, and it was quite an emotional moment, clearly, for both of us. And we met a couple of times more, and the last time we met was in 2007 in Albuquerque. We went and stayed with her for a little while. But what she introduced me to was Mannheim, and originally I was kind of resistant. I felt I'd done enough, or what was the point, etc., etc. And then I was driving through Sheffield, and on the back of a bus there was Mannheim Antiques. Now, Mannheim is a fairly unusual name to find in Sheffield. So, I mean, Mannheim is actually a steel town, so it's quite possible there were links, but nevertheless, it piqued my attention. And then I was in Liverpool and saw Mannheim Autos at the side of the road where they were selling used or damaged cars. And I thought, okay, right, I'll get over there. So I went over to Mannheim and found a few things. I found a Jewish cemetery which had 37 graves of Nauans over the years. And I also found a book in the library called Old Families of Mannheim, Alte Familien das Mannheim. And it was written in a dense Gothic print in German, and I couldn't read a word of it, but I managed to get it translated. And what it showed was that my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Abraham Moses Nauan, had been born in a town called Nauan, not far from Potsdam, outside Berlin. And he had a son called Salomon Abraham Nauan, and Salomon Abraham Nauan was married. I'm not sure his wife's name, apart from Mrs. Nauan, but he didn't have any children, and he wanted to have children, and so he decided to get divorced. Now, at the time, the King of Germany, King Frederick, had decreed that there would only be 120 Jewish families living in Berlin, and to get a divorce, he had to get permission or lets from 100 rabbis. So he had to go on a long walk, and he walked around Germany, getting these 100 rabbis to agree that he could be divorced. There was a kind of, not a rule, but an idea that families were about children and about the progeny and descendants and so on. And therefore he was, I think the idea was that if you were married and you didn't have children for 10 years, then you should probably try with somebody else and see if that's the problem. And when he ended up in Mannheim, he got his 100th let and decided to stay. He became a protected Jew, and clearly there was enough evidence around Mannheim that he was that family was well regarded at the time. He moved to Mannheim in 1744. So he met and married Caroline Gundesheim, who and they had two children, and one of them was Abraham Salomon Nauan, who had 6 children, one of whom was Julius. Julius Nauan married Henrietta Hober, and they had 7 children. And of the 7 children, Karl was the great-grandfather of Anne Massmann, and Edward was my great-great-grandfather. Edward had, it's written that he had 3 children, but my father's recollection when he wrote to me was that actually there were 4. There was Henrietta, there was Frank, that was my grandfather, and there was Herbert. But in my father's recollection, there was also a son called John, who was apparently eaten by a lion in Africa. Whether any of that's true or not, I have no idea, and I have no record or recollection of it at all, of course. So Frank had 2 children, Peggy, my Aunt Peggy, her proper name was Margaret, and my father, John Adams Nauan. The Adams came from his mother, who was Frances Adam. Frank and Frances were both born in England. There was a lot of denial at that time of the German roots, because it was after the First World War. Saying that you came from Germany was not such a great idea. And Frank lived in London between the wars, and or in fact pre-war. My father was born in Paris, but they had hoped that he would be born in England. He had dual nationality for at least a portion of his life. But he was born in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and during the First World War, and the German occupation was very close to where he lived. So it was probably quite a frightening time. I know that my father was brought up in a house that was had some sinister feelings about it, and he felt quite uncomfortable living there, I know. So my father had 3 children. He was married to my mother, Noel Mathers. Mathers was a corruption of the original MacGregor name, which the MacGregor clan had from the 1500s, 1600s. James I of England had decreed that these Protestant renegade clan, MacGregor, should be outlawed, and therefore if you met a MacGregor in the 1600s, you could kill them and be given all their land and all their buildings and everything that they owned. So it wasn't popular being a MacGregor at that time. So a lot of them left and went to Ireland, changed their names to avoid suspicion and so on. They moved back from Ireland in the 1800s and continued their life. My mother was related far back. I'm not quite sure of the absolute direction of flow, because there are men and women involved, so it dots about a bit. Her mother's family were musicians, and her mother's father was a musician, worked with on the Charge of the Light Brigade with Mendelssohn. So there was it was a complex scenario. My mother and father met and married during the war. I think they went to a dance just before the war, but I didn't believe that my mother's first love was my father. I think there was somebody else, but he disappeared during the war. So there was a certain amount of tragedy. But the big tragedy for my mother was that in 1941 she lost her brother. Now, my mother's father, Jack Mathers, he was an electrical engineer, electrical contractor, and they were installing electricity into houses at the time, pre-war, during the war, and post-war, First World War. He'd been a soldier in the Black Watch Regiment in the Boer War and in the First World War, and so he'd seen quite a lot of action. My mother's brother, Richard Mathers, Uncle Dick, he was known as, the stories always went that he'd died in a tragic accident where the alternator of his plane had failed and he crashed into a hill and died at the scene. The truth I found out after my mother died. I went to the RAF museum in Cambridgeshire and Duxford, and I wanted to look at a fairy fulmar. I love connections in things. I love the way things interrelate. And when I was a bird watcher, fulmars were always the bird that I was most fascinated by. I'd been on Fair Isle, and on Fair Isle they had a little game that you played. You had, when you were ringing fulmars, you put one in your hands, or somebody put one in your hands, and you closed your eyes, and you had to say when the fulmar had left. All right, it just flew off, and everybody always got it wrong, because they left with such grace and such elegance that you never felt them leave. You just were aware that they were no longer there after a moment or two. So I was always interested in fulmars. And my uncle, Dick, he had flown a Fairey Fulmar. It was a Fleet Air Arm plane. They were a peculiar plane in that they sometimes they had 3 engines, 2 on one side and 1 on the other, because they were short of parts and things like that. But when I went to the RAF museum, they only had a little bit of a cockpit of a Fairey Fulmar. But the guy there said that I should contact the Fleet Air Arm Museum in Yeovilton, and that they had an archivist, and she would probably give me some details. So when I got home, I emailed the Fleet Air Arm Museum, and the archivist emailed back within 10 minutes. And she said that Uncle Dick had died unauthorized low flying over the airfield, and he crashed his Fairey Fulmar into another Fairey Fulmar. So 2 out of the squadron of 6 had been bussed by Dick's exploits, and he would not have been a popular guy after his death. So there was shame and disquiet, and it left as a family secret. It relates because when my mother had her first child, she named him after her hero, which was Uncle Dick, who died in shame. And my brother Richard committed suicide in 2004, and so it wasn't history repeating itself exactly, but it's kind of, you can see that the layer of things that need to be rectified in lifetimes and in histories. So my parents had 3 children. They had my brother Richard in 1947. I was born in 1950, and my sister Penny was born in 1959. In 1952, my mother she poured out some boiling milk for a hot chocolate for herself and a glass of orange juice for me. I was well known as into everything and a bit of an annoying kid, and always had a free thinking attitude to everything. And I picked the wrong cup and pulled the hot chocolate down onto my chest. Now, I know from work that I've done more recently that in that moment, my heart stopped and my breathing stopped for a moment or two. And it feels like there was a moment where I could reflect on whether I wanted to be alive or dead. And I decided that I wanted to be alive. And so I grew up in a framework that was, much more free thinking than I would have ever imagined. And I respect that moment, but it's how I got to be me.